In this lesson, we're going to be looking at complex conditional statements, and these are the same as the conditional statements we've been looking at. The only difference is you might have two necessary conditions or two sufficient conditions. And those conditions are going to be connected with and or. So I might have something like, if it rains tomorrow, I can't go to the dump and I have to cover the pool. So that would be a conditional statement that had two necessary conditions. The only thing that's slightly difficult about these conditionals is remembering how to make contrapositives of them. So we're going to address that in this lesson and also talk about a special consideration when you have conditions that are connected by or, the word or. So let's get started. Okay, so here's an example of the types of statements that we're looking at here. You might have A, then B or C. So an example of that might be, if I stepped on a nail, I have to either go to the emergency room or the pharmacy to get a tetanus shot. In that one, we have two necessary conditions that are linked by or. So at least one of those is going to happen. Here we have a statement with two necessary conditions and both of them have to happen. So for example, if my girlfriend stays home sick, I have to pick up the dry cleaning and go to the grocery store. On this side, we see statements where we have two sufficient conditions. So either one of these could trigger this necessary condition happening. So if there's flooding or an earthquake, residents will evacuate to the neighboring town. Something like that. And then here finally we get two sufficient conditions, and this time both of them have to happen to trigger the necessary condition here. So if Evan plays golf and Josh plays golf, Justin will play golf as well. Might be an example of that type of statement. So they're not really different at all than the conditional statements that we've been working with. You just have to keep track of the fact that there's extra sufficient or extra necessary conditions. And in the case of and, both are going to occur. And so we see that here. A and B have to occur before you trigger C. Just A alone would not be a trigger for C. So for example, in that statement, if Josh and Evan play golf, then Justin will play as well. Well, if only Evan plays golf, say, then you're not sure yet whether Justin would play golf. It's not necessarily a trigger. Also, if, just Josh plays golf and you don't know what Evan's doing yet, well, you're not sure yet whether Justin is playing golf because there's two sufficient conditions. Here, on the other hand, say this was if Evan or Josh plays golf, then Justin will. Well, in that case, then, if either one plays, say you only know Evan plays golf, well, then you would automatically know that Justin plays golf as well. Either one of these things happening is sufficient and is a trigger for this. So, or and conditions really are different in that way. And I think just if you stop and think about the rule and what it's saying, it's easy enough to process that. It's just something to be aware of. Now, statements with or can be a little bit tricky because I think when we talk about the word or in everyday language, we're thinking that either one of these things happens, but not both, right? So if I go to Taco Bell, I'm going to order either a gordita or a chalupa. If I say that to you, you probably think that I'm just going to have one or the other, not necessarily both. But in formal logic, just because you have this or here, it doesn't exclude the possibility that that means both outcomes are going to happen. So in the case of this rule, both necessary conditions. And we refer to that as the inclusivity of the word or. On the LSAT, if it can't be both, they're going to tell you. So if you saw this rule, A, then B or C, there would be some language saying, but not both, if it could only be one or the other. And you actually see that quite a bit on games. But just remember that on the LSAT, just because you see an or, it doesn't mean this or that, but not both. It just means one or the other is definitely going to happen. In this rule, one of these necessary conditions is definitely going to have to occur if this occurs. And with this rule, if just one of these occurs or the other, it's good enough to trigger this necessary condition occurring. So you only need one sufficient condition to occur. But both could, and that's not violating the rule or anything. That's a kind of complicated matter, so make sure you check that out in the text lesson. Now, the trickiest thing to do with complex conditionals and where people get most screwed up with them is making contrapositive. So we're going to slow that down in the text lesson, but just a little preview here. The key thing to always do when you make a contrapositive of a complex conditional is you have to do your usual flipping and negating, right? So not B, not C, then not A. But what people often try to do here is just keep it as is and say not B or not C, then not A, and think that this is a proper contrapositive of this statement here. But this doesn't get the meaning right? This here tells you that if A happens, then B or C happens. So just one of those two things has to happen. So what we would need to know that A is definitely not happening, sorry I didn't cross that off, is we would need to know that neither of those things occurs. Not B and not C occurs. Then we would know not A, right? So that takes a little bit of time to think through. So we're going to really try and slow that down and talk about it at length in the text lesson. But the general rule that I want you to remember is whenever you make contrapositives of these kind of statements, you always change or to and vice versa. So if you start off with the statement A and B, then C, and you make a contrapositive of that, you're just going to change that to an or. Not C, then not A, or not B. So you took your and it becomes an or in the contrapositive here. Okay, so now that we have that down, make sure you review the text lesson, slow it down here, and pay close attention to how we do these contrapositives especially, and you'll be ready to move on to the next topic.